I'm Vicki Hogarth and welcome to Southwest Magazine. My guest today is Bayside resident Gerhard Pohle, who is here to talk about his memoir, Waterlust. Thank you so much, Gerhard, for sitting down with me today.
Oh, absolute pleasure to be here.
Tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write your life story and what the memoir encompasses in a nutshell.
Well, I guess in a nutshell, it's a memoir of my formative years, much of which were spent traveling around the world, more or less being dragged along by my parents. And, there were many different profound experiences for me during these years because I was exposed to so many different cultures, different people from around the world. And I guess it really, in a way, made me who I became, and is responsible for quite a few of my traits, if you want. My love of exploration of animals and the natural world. It was responsible for me eventually becoming a marine biologist as well. But I also learned some of the really bad things during those years. So I guess chief among them was I developed a real hate for weapons and war because as a young child I was in the midst of that. So it isn't just all wonderful things, but so that is in terms of what the book is about. But in terms of, you were getting at what made me want to do this, I have to admit that it was a bit of pushing from the outside as much as my own desire to do this. My desire to do it was based on the fact that I have 4 grandchildren now, and when they will be at an age to understand what their grandpa did, I might just not be around. So for their sake, I thought that it would be worth doing this. But during my travels with one of my best friends and my own cousin, we are both motorcycle nuts. We travel a lot together on bikes. And you sit there having beers and talking about things. So, of course, some of the things that I went through in those years came up, and he said, Gerhard, you have to write this down. And so this is just one of those examples. There were more during the years. So that certainly was one of the major reasons. But I have to admit that I had very mixed feelings about doing this. First of all, because there's a huge effort involved as far as I was concerned. During those 3 decades that this book is about, a lot happened. So just to put that all back together was quite the task. My parents wrote a lot of letters, so I knew there was a lot of information there, but I'd have to go through all this. So that's sort of the logistical stuff. But I also knew that I would have to go places that I wouldn't necessarily be all that comfortable with. And that meant that, well, let me put it this way. I sort of set a few ground rules on how I was going to do this. So the time period was one of them. But the other one was, how do I go about this? What do I write about? Mm-hmm. And I guess the fundamental precept I went by is I'm going to tell the truth. Sounds very simple. Not so hard to actually do, as I found out, because you can't just talk about all the great and exciting things that you did and that happened. In this case, you have to dig deeper down, and your shortcomings will eventually, of course, come up. And I come from a professional world where you don't talk about such things. Everything's great. Everything's perfect. I will never forget a board of directors meeting we had when I said we have a problem, and I was scolded for even mentioning that word and said, Gerhard, we don't have problems, we only have challenges. So that's the world I came from, and now this. So, but I knew that in the end that would be the thing to do. And so, as one reviewer said, it's an unfiltered memoir. In other words, I did not shy away from talking about these things, and I guess all I can say is I count on the reader's sympathy for being frank.
Well, I think what's beautiful too is you have all this background in writing, particularly scientific writing as a marine biologist, as a PhD, but that process of writing must be so different from when you set out to do a memoir.
Yes.
What was your process like as a memoirist, and not as a scientific writer, but specifically as someone setting out to write their own life story? What did you do? How did you tackle it every day?
Yeah, so you're absolutely correct. This is I come from the world of science as a retired marine biologist now, but I wrote quite a few papers, even book chapters. And in science, writing is extremely disciplined. Every word counts. Accuracy, precision, interpretation has to be very limited, and has to be absolutely tight. And you cannot express opinions or emotions or experiences. So I really felt like somebody like a greenhorn when it came down to doing this particular thing. But again, I guess the way that I started to putting some things together. So in that sense, my science background really did help, because first you have to do your research, and we know that memory changes over time, and as I delved more into things, I saw that actually. But luckily, my parents, well, this of course was pre-internet, and my parents were prolific letter writers, and because we were separated at times, my mother and father my father lived in India, we lived in Germany, things like that. So there was a lot of writing going on. And unfortunately, there were also some tape recordings, but those, who has one of those tape players anymore? I don't. And, of course, those tapes also degrade over time. So I didn't go through those, but there were over 200 letters. And, I had to find them, sort them, go through them, read them. But then I found so many interesting things that I had completely forgotten about. So the research part of it certainly got the whole thing going, but
I'm holding it up right now because it's an extensive memoir, but still you've had such a fascinating life full of travel, adventure, challenges. How did you decide what to include and what not to include? What was that process like of looking at your life and figuring out what do I put in this?
Yeah, so I guess the most important part for me was to get across how I became who I became. And those early years, those childhood years, were very important to me. And so I felt that it was crucial to start right from the beginning, because a lot of the things that made me started right then and there. And the circumstances under which I grew up, I mean, this was just shortly after World War II. My parents were still struggling, and they were trying to find their own footing. And my father, who had this genetically trend of needing to see the world, I mean, this is just unbelievable as far as I was concerned. So he always wanted to go somewhere, go do things somewhere, do something new. So that needed to be in the book, of course. So when I had to go back before I could go forward. And again, having to do this really entailed not just doing the research, but then interpret what this all meant. So I decided to write the book as I more or less was at the time. I didn't write it with the way I see things today. I wrote it as the person at that time. So I hope that way it comes across as genuine. Now and then I do divert and interpret things, usually at the end of a chapter somewhere, or when there had to be something said about it and it's there as a footnote. But I wanted to be the genuine character that I was at the time, so I decided to write that way.
All these things to consider when tackling memoir that really they make such a significant difference to the way what the reader takes away from the book too. So many things that I think that anyone that was tackling their first memoir would have to think about as well. Was that something you're expecting to deliberate on when you set out to sit down to write your life story?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Well, I just decided at one point, I should start by saying that I don't take things lightly. That's a trait, good or bad, that's what I have. So when I get into something, I really stick to it and I do it. So once I committed, I really went for it. And it was a 5-year effort.
Well, okay, so this book came out 2024.
That's right.
5 years. Did you sit down and write every day? What was your actual process like for writing? Was it 3 hours in the afternoon? Did you have set times, or did you wait for inspiration?
No. It started off as my scientific approach, right? You just have to have discipline, sit down, and that's how it started. I sat down and said, okay, I'm going to just start and see how it goes. But that I soon found that there were quickly times where I was unsure of things. I didn't know really how to proceed further. So you get to these places where you feel really lost in a way. But I think that's something that every writer goes through. And so there were frequent breaks in what I did. The other thing, because I am a real outdoor enthusiast, but not so much in the winter, I really did almost all of the writing in wintertime. So during the warmer time of the year, there wasn't much time spent on it. Certainly time contemplating, but the actual writing was done in the winter. And I liked that because it gave me time to think about things and how to proceed. So I did certainly have those times when things just poured out, and I just let that happen. But I did not force myself in the sense, okay, today I have to write 2 pages. No, it's not the way I worked.
Resiliency is an important theme throughout the book, and I think that anyone who meets you now would see someone with their PhD, a marine biologist, and not think of the challenges you may have encountered growing up. Why was it so important for you to make resiliency such an important theme throughout? Well,
the simple way to put that maybe is to say that there were a few low points in my life, and I think most humans go through these, but in the end, we all have to move on with life, and it is not necessarily something that I told myself or that I knew, but looking back, and my wife pointed this out to me actually, is that I had this trait of what she called PP. And it's not about going to the washroom, it's perseverance pays. Yeah. And that actually became a slogan in our family, and I engraved it on my son's watch one day. And having determination to find a way to get through the low points, it's certainly one of the big points in my life on how I managed to move on. There are other things, of course, that are important in life. But to me, that was a very important thing to do, and it helped me.
What were the therapeutic benefits? I find this so fascinating with people that that do their memoirs is that addressing those hard times very honestly. It's hard enough on its own, but there's something about doing it that can be so therapeutic that once you put it down on paper, it can change you in a way. Did you find the process of putting your life story and going at it so head on with honesty transformed you after you did it, when the memoir was done?
It certainly did.
In what ways?
Well, first of all, because I learned so much more. In terms of facts, actually, because, 30, 40 years down the line, if you look at things, you can find out a lot more. This particularly involved understanding the mental state of those around me and my own. And so that was super enlightening. But it's also understanding how one went through all these things, and in the end, that this was actually probably a really good thing, even though we didn't think so at the time. We thought, oh my goodness, these are terrible times. But in the end, really, it is really through pain that we grow, that we become better human beings. And I have to say, this is something that I only really realized after I had written the book.
That is I believe that too, that the obstacles and the challenges we face become what our character is, right? I mean, as much as we like to celebrate all our successes, it's our failures often and our challenges that make us the person we are when we're willing to confront them.
We're human.
What would your advice be to someone who is considering, I think writing a memoir is on so many people's wish list of something to do, whether they publish it or whether they just do it for their family. I know there's even a workshop at the library in St. Andrews right now for memoirs, so I'm sure they will watch this episode and love to know what your advice is for anyone out there who might be in the midst of it or thinking about sitting down and trying to put pen to paper to tell their life story.
Well, first of all, I should say I do not really consider myself an expert in this. I've written a memoir. Yes, I have. And I can talk about what was involved in doing that. But I think it probably is different for other people as well. So from my experience, you need to be prepared to spend a lot of time not just writing, but looking at yourself so that you can bring these feelings and emotions to paper. That to me was the biggest challenge. And it's only when I started putting them into context, understanding what made me feel a certain way about somebody else, or even about me, and what my state of mind was at that time. In other words, sort of taking the 10,000-mile view of things, really removing yourself from things after you've gone through the details, and try to understand why things happen that way. From that perspective, I think that helped me a lot.
Did it change? This is something I'm curious of, just because I'm writing a column about my dog right now, and I've done a little bit of memoir style work in the past. But one thing I find fascinating about it is that when you do like you did and you research your own life or an aspect of your own life, it can even change your understanding of it. And that's what it's done for me, is going back and saying, okay, well, if I need to know the details and the dates, my brain remembers something one way, but when I look back at different things I wrote down or emails, sometimes it tells me a different story. Did you ever encounter a part of your life where you're like, oh, wow, my brain remembers it this way, but as I look back on it now, I'm connecting it in a different way?
That's a good question. I'm not sure that I really can fire off an answer, but I certainly remember incidents where, let's just say, I understood why people did certain things that I didn't understand before. So, for example, after looking what my parents went through, I understood a lot more some of the less pleasant things that I do remember in that relationship. And, you know, to be perfectly honest, this involved that my mother and father had disagreements quite often. And, you know, without getting into details about this, it's perfectly obvious to me when I did the research that my mother suffered from PTSD. Nobody knew what that was. That wasn't, and you know, anything that involved mental state is not something one talked about at all at that time. And so a bell went off, and I said, well, I can understand now why she was in that emotional state. When you read the symptoms of PTSD, that makes perfect sense. Wow. Had I known something like that at the time, I would have dealt with this in a very different way than I did. And so, yeah, in that sense, you know, some light bulbs did go off.
How incredible. And has it changed the way you approach your life now, ever after having gone through this process? Has it enlightened you in a way that you didn't expect?
Absolutely. I approach things very differently now when I'm with people. Like I have to admit that I have been a lot more judgmental of things. One goes by first impressions a lot, right? And sometimes people do unpleasant things, and one says, I really don't want to have anything to do with that person. But very often when you find out is that there are some very good reasons why that person is that way, and if you communicate them in a way that they understand, it opens up a wonderful relationship. So yeah, becoming less judgmental and seeing people for what they are and what things they went through in their life that made them that way, I think has softened me up a lot.
Now, I know your book talks about your travels all around the world. You're growing up partly in Germany as well, but you're here today at a time in Canadian history where we're all feeling quite patriotic, and I do love that your story, I'm not going to say ends here in Canada, the book ends with you in Canada. Your story continues, but you're wearing a Canadian flag right now too. What was it about Canada that made you want to put roots down somewhere after all the extensive travel and adventures, especially in tropical places that you've had?
Yes.
In the ocean.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up.
This cold part of the world, this is where you chose to
exactly.
make your home.
So the book is really in two parts. I call it actually book one and book two. The book one is all the time before Canada, and then the remainder is about my life in Canada and how it started. And it ends up with me coming here to St. Andrews, really. But what made me want to stay in Canada is a big part of this, because quite frankly, my parents didn't want me to stay in Canada. My parents eventually retired to Germany. That was always the plan. After my father's last assignment, which was in Canada. And at that time, the reader will find out I had a lot of challenges in school. I changed school 13 times in 13 years, and needless to say, that doesn't have just positive effects. And it was when I came to Canada that I finally got the help and the support and the encouragement at the educational institution that I attended that made me see the world completely differently. I have never forgotten the support that I got from the teachers, and my life took off right after that. This was a major reason for me. Aside from everything else, you know, I love the open spaces. I love nature, and you know, you have all of that here in a way that is quite different from Europe. Not that I have anything against Europe, my home country, but this is where I've put my roots down, and I have absolutely no regrets more than ever now that this is where I live. a wonderful place.
You have a love affair with the ocean as well. Is that in part because, traveling so much, the ocean always feels like home, regardless of, which part of you could be in Barbados or in St. Andrews and you're still in the Atlantic Ocean?
Yeah, certainly true. I mean, one of my bucket list items was always to live near the ocean. And my wife shared that dream. And also, of course, to work in that environment. So that's why I became a marine biologist. I was lucky enough to find a career here, which is another great story, but I did eventually end up here, and I would have never expected that, actually. And I moved up from Miami to come here. But that's how the world works sometimes. And I have to honestly say, when I first got here, I wasn't all that impressed by things. St. Andrews was very different in the 1970s than what it is today. And, I got so attached that, I never wanted to move away. So, but having then found a place where we could actually live right by the water was certainly a dream come true. And I never saw a reason ever to move from there. So that's where I lived for the last quarter century.
We have to have you back on the show soon, because I think we've only touched on a little from the book so far. So I'd love to have you back again soon,
all right,
Gerhard. But what do you hope for anyone? First of all, I need to know for people at home where they can buy this book.
So first of all, it's available online. But I'm also keen to sell my own copies. I've ordered a few, so people can get in touch with me. I'm listed in the phone book. 529-3944 is the number. And I'll sell them as long as I still have some copies available.
529
3944.
3944. I love doing small town TV, that we can list your home phone number on television.
Great.
People to buy your book, and I recommend that they do. And I'd love to have you back, Gerhard. It's really fascinating to get to know you and to know someone with your experiences is right here in our community. So thank you for coming in today, and please come back soon.
Thank you. My pleasure.
My guest today has been memoirist Gerhard Pohle. I'm Vicki Hogarth. Thank you for watching Southwest Magazine.
Southwest Magazine is a news and public affairs production of CHCO Television.